Good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. On behalf of the Geoeconomics Center and our colleagues in the Global Energy Center, I am pleased to welcome you to today's event. This morning, the IMF is publishing their new chapter from the World Economic Outlook on fragmentation in commodity markets. The fact that we are standing here discussing this issue is a reflection of how much the world has changed in the past 2 years. The idea that before the IMF World Bank meetings, the fund's leading research would be focused on fragmentation might have sounded strange just 2 years ago. But the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have triggered volatility, food shortages, price spikes, and generated new questions about the fragility of our economic system. Because as difficult as this period has been for the global economy, we all recognize fragmentation could get far worse. Tensions between the world's two largest economies, the US and China, have led policymakers to consider the near and medium-term cost of possible developments of economic blocs. And so, the IMF has stepped up. 6 months ago, during the spring meetings, the IMF launched new research here at the Atlantic Council, trying to assess the cost of geopolitical fragmentation. Today, they continue that body of work by focusing on commodity markets. By diving deep into the potential shocks on energy and food supplies, the IMF is trying to show which countries are most at risk from further fragmentation. As you will see in their research, food security for a range of economies is high on the list of vulnerabilities. This is the kind of work that will set the scene when the world's finance ministers and central bank governors gather next week in Morocco for the first IMF World Bank meetings on the African continent in half a century. The Atlantic Council will be bringing the meetings to you through a series of in-depth interviews with ministers and report launches on the reform of the Bretton Woods system. You can find the full lineup of our events now in the chat and on our website. But the journey to these meetings actually begins today with the release of this important chapter. We thank the IMF for coming to the Atlantic Council to discuss this work. We have a fantastic panel of experts to react to the findings. But first, let me turn the floor to our moderator, Gerard DePippo, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst at Bloomberg Economics, to lead us through our conversation. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So today we have 3 panelists. We have Martin Sturmer, who is an economist in the research department at the IMF, Dr. Ellen Wald, who is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council in the Global Energy Center, and Reed Blakemore, who is the director of research and programs at the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. What we're going to do is, soon I'll turn to Martin to give comments to summarize the key findings of the report. But before we do that, I just want to remind everyone in the audience, you actually can ask questions live. So if you want to log on to askac.org and then click on this event, you can submit questions and then we can ask them. Martin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for having us. So today we are launching our World Economic Outlook chapter on fragmentation in commodity markets. And this has been 10 months of work, so let me thank the team for working on this. Notably Jorge Alvarez, my co-lead, then Mehdi Andalusi, Christopher Evans, Chiara Maggi, Marika Santoro, Alex Solacci, and then the guidance from Petya Topalova. So let's dive right into the opening remarks. So new trade barriers, next slide, hold on. New trade barriers in commodity markets have doubled since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And you can see that this is across all types of commodities. And we can also see that for commodities, this increase has been much sharper than for other traded goods. So now geopolitical tensions could make things much worse. And our chapter is really a risk scenario, where we look at what would be the impact of further fragmentation on commodity markets, the economy, on food security, but also the energy transition. So let me give you 3 key takeaways here. First is that minerals and some agricultural commodity prices are highly vulnerable in the event of fragmentation. The second key takeaway is that low-income countries will be the most affected in the event of further fragmentation. That's because they are major importers of agricultural goods. So this has strong food security implications. And then finally, with fragmentation in critical minerals markets, the energy transition could become much more costly. We derive these results based on highly stylized simulations. And we want to show main economic transmission channels here. And so we assume that each of these 48 commodities in our sample is, each of these markets is divided into 2 blocks. And I'm very happy to talk more about these blocks and about the underlying assumptions here. But let's go to the next slide. Oh, here, sorry. So this chart shows the changes in prices that would occur with more severe fragmentation. And it shows the distribution of these 48 commodity price changes. And what we can see is that minerals prices would be affected the most. So that's where we would see the largest price changes in our illustrative simulations. And we can, so let me give you an example here so that this is easier to understand. So here, this dot here is cobalt. So the price of cobalt would increase by more than 500% in the event of fragmentation, basically when splitting the global cobalt market into 2 separate markets. So why is this? What are the underlying mechanisms here? There are 2. One is the high market concentration, and the second is how fast can supply and demand react if there is an imbalance in this market. So for cobalt, about 70% of cobalt is produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo, so it's highly concentrated. And then cobalt is very hard to substitute in electric vehicle batteries, and it can take years to build mines for cobalt. So this basically means that if we divide the world into 2 trading blocks, there's one block, of course, with Congo, where we would see an oversupply of cobalt, but then there's the other block that would see an undersupply of cobalt, and that's why prices would so strongly increase in that block. We can also see that there are some outliers for agricultural goods, such as soya beans, that will be heavily impacted from such fragmentation scenarios. What I learned from our chapter is that, at least in most of our simulations, energy is less vulnerable than many of the other commodities. And that's because energy production is less concentrated than some of these other commodities. So let's move on to the economic impact. So we show that low-income countries are most affected in the event of fragmentation. Here on the left, we see the aggregate impact on world GDP in the event of fragmentation, and it's relatively modest with negative 0.3 percentage points. Why is this so modest? The reason is that there are offsetting effects. So if the price of cobalt goes up, there are consumers that, of course, need to pay higher prices, but at the same time, producers are benefiting. So there's some redistribution involved here that does not show up when looking at these aggregate numbers. However, our simulations show that low-income countries would, on average, lose most. So here it's about minus 1.2%. And for some, it could be much more. The reason is that low-income countries are major importers of food commodities, and they present a large fraction of households' expenditure. The third takeaway is about the energy transition. So fragmenting critical minerals markets would make the energy transition more costly and thereby reduce investment. And here, critical minerals markets refer to copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. And so in a world that is fragmented, the prices would be 300% higher than in a world without, that is with fully integrated markets. And so because the cost is higher for investing into renewables and electric vehicles, that's why investment would go down. So well, it would not go down, but it would be lower than in the case of integrated market. Here in this case, it's roughly 30%. So investment would be 30% lower with fragmented market than with integrated markets. So what can policy makers do about this? The first best response is to prevent fragmentation in the first place through multilateral cooperation and through enhancing WTO rules on export restrictions, export tariffs, and discriminatory subsidies. The reason why that is important, because this can prevent vicious cycles where countries impose restrictions on each other. If that is not possible, countries could also focus on more narrow agreements with a focus on highly critical and highly vulnerable commodities. And they could establish so-called corridor agreements to keep the trade flowing for these in these markets. So they could establish a green corridor, for example, for key critical minerals, or a food corridor for key food commodities. And then finally, through our work, we realize that the data on minerals markets is particularly scarce. So we suggest a platform or an international organization similar to what we have for the International Energy Agency or the Food and Agriculture Organization, but with a focus on on minerals markets. So let me conclude. Our work shows that fragmentation in commodity markets, or more severe fragmentation in commodity markets, could have substantial economic implications with repercussions for food security and the energy transition. And we would need multilateral cooperation to prevent this. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and to our discussion here.
Thank you, Martin. We're going to turn to Ellen in a minute, but I just want to ask one quick clarifying question, which you've already mentioned, which is, what are the blocks you're modeling in your scenarios?
That's a very good question. So, of course, we are economists, so we are very humble in our thinking. What is the most plausible scenario of this? I think it's very hard. So what we take here as a starting point, and this is really about talking about hypotheticals because we want to highlight economic channels, is the vote on Ukraine in the United Nations in 2022. And that's how we basically create these two blocks, one US and European and other countries block, and then a Russia and China and other countries block. But we do robustness checks for this, so we also look into other block configurations, and we also, in one of our exercises, look at a neutral block.
Great, okay, we'll talk more about that in a bit. But first, Ellen, do you want to give some response remarks?
Sure, thank you, and thank you so much for this really stimulating chapter. I think that the attempt to really quantify these aspects of trade that are very difficult to quantify, and the findings are sorely needed both by market analysts, commodities traders, policy makers, and also geopolitical analysts. And I absolutely found the minerals fragmentation model particularly compelling here. One caveat, I'm not an economist. I'm actually trained as a historian. So
nice.
I'm not used to reviewing papers that have terms like stochastic and dynamic general equilibrium. But I hope that my thoughts will be useful when considering how non-economists or non-econometricians might look at and utilize these results. So one element I really particularly appreciated was that for every model and every result, how certain variable elements were always considered and how that might affect the results, because as we know, the world does not conform to economic models. It's always much more messy. And for example, all these scenarios, as you mentioned, are based on this two-block scenario. And we have kind of been there before. My brain always goes, well, where have we seen something like this before? Most recently during the Cold War. But even then, that bifurcation was never really complete. We had the third way, attempts by countries like India and Egypt to do business and have friendly diplomatic relations with both sides. Didn't always work, but it was definitely an attempt. I'd say that's really a matter for the historians. I think of particular relevance here is to consider in what ways might this bifurcation, how would it work in real life and play out in real life, and how might that impact the results. So I kind of have two main points that I want to get to. One has to do with, I really appreciate your point that energy commodities have actually been the least impacted by fragmentation, but that's what gets the most news coverage. It's all about what's happening with oil prices, what's happening with natural gas prices, even coal prices. And your analysis showed that really that's perhaps not where we should be focusing all of our attention and concern. I think that oil traders are probably the most ubiquitous. We don't see a huge call for lithium trading rooms, although that may come to be in the near future. But so I think it's important to really focus on, and your analysis just brings home the fact that while so much of our focus was on oil, really what happened was the deck chairs got a bit rearranged, but things seem to still be flowing. Most people have the energy and the power that they need, though obviously some, I think, what we call lower income countries are still having a hard time in some respects. One element, though, that I would bring maybe from my study of energy is that when you look at the impact of groups like OPEC, I would call them I call it kind of a supranational club for oil producers rather than a cartel. But that kind of organization transcends the bifurcated bloc narrative. So looking, for example, Saudi Arabia from a geopolitical perspective would be on Team US-EU plus. That's how I kind of refer to it. They're supplying Europe with all sorts of crude oil since Russia no longer is. But, you know, and you talked about how military alliances were used to create these blocs. There isn't a formal military alliance, but I would say considering the US military basically guarantees Saudi security, they'd be on that team. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is buying lots of Russian diesel that Europe used to buy. They're either using it domestically or they're mixing it with their own diesel and selling it back to Europe. So that's an example of kind of where the blocs aren't quite so separate. It's also regularly colluding with Russia to push oil prices higher. And so I think it might be useful, at least for the non-economists, to consider that when it comes to other commodities, I wonder how the introduction of, say, a lithium OPEC, or we probably won't see a cobalt OPEC, considering 70% of the production is centered in one country, might impact prices on top of fragmentation. Would it result in more price stability, or would you see even more price instability as a result? I do think it's important to remember that when it comes to oil, at least, geopolitical enemies in other respects can be best friends when they get together in Vienna. And so what might the development of a cartel-esque group mean for critical minerals in this age of fragmentation? So that's my first point. My second point is that, and you do acknowledge in the paper that companies that you looked at this in terms of countries, but that it is in fact companies that are developing these minerals, not the countries themselves. And some of those companies are national companies, so you can kind of assume that the will of the state's will and the company's will are basically aligned. But that's not the case, I think, when it comes necessarily to critical minerals, because companies of one nationality companies in one particular nationality heavily control the mining and refining process of at least some of these very important rare earths. Cobalt might be mined in the DRC, but Chinese companies, largely financed by the Chinese government, own most of the 19 mines in that country. And not only that, but in exchange for about 68% share of these mines, Chinese hospital and railway companies agreed to build roads and hospitals all over the DRC. And that wasn't out of the kindness of their hearts. That was because they wanted to make it more difficult for the DRC to get rid of China. So politically, you might be able to say, well, let's get the Congo on the Team US-EU side so that we can have the oversupply of cobalt. Turns out maybe it won't even be an oversupply because we need so much of it for our electric vehicle revolution. But I think that regardless of how Congo votes in the UN, it's going to be solidly on team China-Russia. Because, and block switching in that case might be nearly impossible because from an economic standpoint, they can't just kick out the Chinese companies or nationalize these mines because it would bring an immediate halt to mining and revenue from which they might never recover. South Africa, I think, would be another example of this. South Africa is also significantly in debt to China. So I think it would be helpful to consider what blocks these countries that have these resources would actually fall into. The policy implications, I think, are pretty interesting, and I think it's important to consider the national security implications, how we might develop new supply chains that maybe don't include China. I think a lot of the focus on that tends to be in domestic production. We have to produce these things domestically. I don't think that that's, as you mentioned, that's not necessarily a wise policy. It would be better to maybe develop these supply chains with friendly countries. But I also, and mines that aren't funded by the Chinese government, you can have refining take place in Mexico or Canada or France or Hungary. It doesn't necessarily have to be domestic. Then the other last policy implication that I would encourage people to think about, particularly when it comes to the clean energy transition, is to consider, is this really the clean energy transition that we want? Maybe we can reconsider. It seems like the current line of thinking is the transportation sector produces X percentage of global emissions, so therefore if we stop using emissions generating vehicles, then these emissions will be eliminated. That's not the case. EVs have somehow been labeled as non-emissions generating vehicles, but they're not. An EV is only as clean as the power it runs on. An EV is only as clean as its battery. Lithium mining and cobalt mining are not clean. Coal power and oil power are not clean. Natural gas is a bit cleaner. I think maybe the real challenge that this analysis exposes is for the policymakers to maybe rethink the meaning of the clean energy transition. Is electrification really the best or the only way? Can we come up with new, potentially better paradigms to make transportation cleaner that don't revolve around replacing internal combustion engine vehicles with battery-powered vehicles, given the immense challenges that I think have been exposed here? And also recall that it's not just EVs that these minerals are used for, but also important semiconductors and things that we need for national security, for defense, for all sorts of products and devices that we use all the time. Maybe this could open up conversations about some radically different paradigms for clean energy transition.
Thank you. A lot of threads to pull on there. But first, Reed, do you want to give some remarks?
Yeah. And thanks, Gerard, and thanks, Martin, for the wonderful report. It was incredible. And thanks to Josh and the GeoEcon team for including the Global Energy Center in this effort. And Martin, I think your report offers, while in the mineral space, the focus is on copper, nickel, lithium, and cobalt, right? It offers some lessons that we can carry forward into what is ultimately, a very, very minerals-intense energy transition that we're embarking upon. And to pull upon a few threads that Ellen mentioned here, I think the reality that kind of demand for these metals and minerals is coming out of an exogenous policy impetus, right? You have the benevolence of climate action stewarding this, right, for energy transition, but you also have this undercurrent of competition for economic leadership in key clean energy technologies in the markets that are going to dictate the green economy out to 2050. Supply chain access and resiliency is a key piece of that. And I think, in a way, when you compare that to the discussion around fragmentation, you do have a little bit of live by the sword, died by the sword happening. Mineral dependency and supply chain resiliency is a feature in fragmentation, not a bug. But I want to back up and think through a few features as to why minerals are particularly exposed to that fragmentation, right? The first point here is, outside of the base metals like nickel and copper, when we broaden it out to, the suite of critical minerals, I think we're up to 50 or so now that we've all deemed as critical, right? A lot of these behave more like specialty chemicals than traditional commodity markets, right? The transparency needed for price discovery and contracting isn't terribly mature for a lot of those minerals. Trading volumes vary considerably, and the conditions under which a particular mineral passes from the upstream down to the midstream and ultimately on to the consumer is highly specialized and unique to meet the demands of that consumer end product. Taken together, that creates a very different suite of material conditions related to the commoditization of minerals than you see with kind of the traditional frameworks around oil and gas, et cetera. And I think you see that even anecdotally speaking, because at a macro level, while we see significant policy discussion around building supply chain capacity on the whole, the current determination of what makes a supply chain secure or resilient is actually more about having sufficient touch points across an entire value chain of a mineral, rather than just building the pool of the resource base itself, like you would see with oil and gas, where we're worried about the totality of supply rather than my piece of that supply. So that tension between building, to use a poor metaphor here, the tension between building the size of the pie versus focusing on my size of the pie is a tension here that's almost contributing to that fragmentation that we see. I think that type of exposure bears out strongly in this chapter. Many of the price swings which were presented in your modeling come from the construction of the various geopolitical blocks and the nuance between how those blocks are composed. And while I think the sensitivity analysis varies somewhat mineral to mineral, one of the implicit conclusions I found from the chapter is that price volatility can somewhat be managed by curating the composition of one's block. Which echoes, I think, the broader trend of managing fragmentation that we're seeing not just in the minerals and energy space, but across any number of other policy and geopolitical areas. This is, again, buffeted somewhat by supply chain resiliency and the block management being a foundational part of clean energy competition, where countries are incentivized to create supply chains of trust in order to reliably achieve the economies of scale, in order to support clean energy tech deployment and ultimately exert some sort of market share dominance in clean energy technologies moving forward. Within that block management, and I think you pointed out this in your report as well, you have issues around alternative resource availability, ore quality and price, on-take, off-take in the midstream, as well as value add sharing. All those pieces play a part here, and I think we can kind of talk about what that means within specific blocks later on. And I'll wrap up by reflecting whether or not this is some sort of new normal for us, right? Or is there something we can do about it? You mentioned kind of the multilateral tools that we have available to us, but how do we build those tools in an environment that is inherently competitive and focused on, building supply chains which enable competition rather than building supply chains which enable, cohesion or meeting our broader climate goals? And I think, frankly, so long as we see minerals being caught up in these stratagems around economic leadership out to 2050 and therefore being subject to the tailwinds of a highly fragmented world, it's hard to see minerals not being caught up in that fragmentation. I think your chapter points that out. And therefore, the GDP consequences outlined in your chapter are frankly more than likely to materialize. But I think more concerningly, when we talk about this in the context of broader climate goals, we run the risk of that fragmentation resulting in our energy transition being highly inflationary in nature. And I think that's not good for anybody. In fact, possibly undercutting public commitment or public enthusiasm for climate action, et cetera. Now, to end optimistically, I'll try. I think this hopefully could change over time, right? We're seeing a rhetorical shift from this discussion around decoupling to something more akin to de-risking, which is positive, even if a bit subject to political attitudes. I think increasing the noise of concerns around overall capacity probably and hopefully improves broader governance issues around transparency, which would be great to make these operate more like traditional commodities. And then finally, I think when you look at the sensitivity around critical minerals and economic competition, eventually we will be overdue for some sort of rationalization around mineral criticality, where, to use the U.S. as an example, even though we currently have 50 minerals on our list, there'll be certain minerals which we do absolutely want to retain control over within a block of trusted countries and instead others which were probably willing to cede to the free market, whether that be in other blocks or other sources of concentration in the spirit of advancing global climate goals. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Reed. So we already have 2 questions on a question I was going to ask anyway, and given that you're a historian, I'm definitely going to ask the question. You've already mentioned this, Ellen, but the first question is, what are the actual historical cases where we saw commodity fragmentation occurring, at least in any reasonable degree? You mentioned the Cold War, but said it wasn't really that huge of a fragmentation. Are there other examples?
A second.
Please, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, in terms of oil, I would say that the communist bloc definitely operated more in a closed kind of circle. I think that Russia was supplying its allies with oil. They were getting a lot from Romania, and that kind of was definitely much more of a closed circle. In fact, if you look at like some of the trade patterns and things, they just kind of, they don't even almost include the communist bloc in price calculations because it was so closed. Then I would say you have the rest of the world, but that definitely included, say, I don't know if you call them third way countries. I guess back then we called them third world countries, but we don't call them that anymore. But so then you had the Middle East that was mostly trading with the capitalist bloc, but at the same time they would have relations when it suited them with Russia. So Egypt, for example, got oil from its Middle Eastern neighbors, who were happy to supply it to them, but it also got a lot of military support from the Soviet Union. But the oil suppliers in the Middle East were also selling most of their oil to the U.S. and Europe. So I would say it wasn't really complete in that it wasn't totally bifurcated. But I think once the Soviet Union collapsed and commodity markets, I think, became much more, I mean, there were a lot of other changes that went on as well. I also think one thing to consider is the role of commodities traders and trading groups in all of this, because they are very effective at getting around the block bifurcation in many ways. And so, when you have, say, oil that comes from X place and then it's treated several times and mixed with other oil, then do you really know where it came from? And so that's another way of getting around this block bifurcation, and it has been done. Now the question is, can that happen with minerals? Because like you said, they're really more like specialty. Some of them are more like specialty chemicals. And can you really do that? And I think the answer, at least at this point, is no. But the commodities traders, they are incredibly resourceful. So I wouldn't put it past them to say, if we do end up in a world where Congo is solidly in the China-Russia bloc, and they've got all of the supply and they're controlling the entire supply of cobalt, but the US-EU bloc needs it, I would not put it past some of these groups to figure out how to get that cobalt to the Western bloc without it being totally obvious that it's coming from there. So that's my analysis there.
In the report, at the end, there's a text box where you talk about World War II. So the elephant in the room is war, right? So the 2 big examples would be World War I and World War II, right? Which you talk about a little bit in the report.
Yeah, so we have a nice box that provides the historical background and evidence. And yes, of course, Second World War is one example, with rubber and oil being crucial commodities. Then we also have some episodes of embargoes against specific countries. So OPEC's embargo against the United States on oil, the embargo against South Africa in the 80s and 90s are other examples. But Ellen, you're right that most of these experiences are kind of fluid experiences of fragmentation, where traders allowed at least for some arbitrage between different blocks. And I think our results, they would be more modest in that case, of course, because some arbitrage will be allowed between these different blocks.
Or it could be amplified because the traders know how much money they can make by keeping prices up. So I almost wonder if it could actually go the other way.
And I think, so 2 thoughts. One, on kind of the role of traders in this space, at least in the minerals, in the critical minerals sector writ large. I think the role of traders is particularly interesting because you have such significant opacity across each of these markets. It's a space that's rife for trying to get around embargoes or things like that, and that's largely because it's very difficult to do any sort of traceability regime on any sort of minerals or metals market. On the historical example, I appreciate your reference to kind of fluid fragmentation. I would also characterize kind of what we're beginning to see in the mineral space as this soft fragmentation, right? A very, very recent example is, a lot of the subsidies within the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Directly say that, mineral resources from certain unfriendly countries will not be eligible for these subsidies. And I think that's an important reference point because really we're in the early days of these supply chains developing to the point where they'll be used looking out to 2050 and beyond. And so while that fragmentation is soft right now, I would expect that sort of fragmentation becomes a little more structural, at least in the short term, or there's an attempt to make it structural with, frankly, a lot of the onus for dealing with that fragmentation placed on the downstream kind of auto manufacturers, battery manufacturers, et cetera, because the expectation is foisted upon them to really clarify, I need to access this subsidy, but I can't access it from this particular source of origin. Here's how I'm going to go get it instead. That's really, I think, where the inflationary risk comes from the fragmentation in the minerals market.
So let's stay on the topic of current fragmentation. Mark, you said early that there is some evidence based on the sort of trade interventions that there's more fragmentation, but are there other metrics you're using to determine how much fragmentation there is? Like basically, in the last few years, are we seeing fragmentation and anything like the scale that you're talking about in the report?
Yes, so if we could look at the chart with the price dispersion. So price dispersion is one measure to measure fragmentation. So it's seen here. So usually we would think that as commodities are relatively homogeneous, that the law of one price holds globally. And we can see this for crude oil, for example. So this red line. So in 2020, 2021, even with the pandemic and all these shocks, the price dispersion was very, very low in these markets. And we measure price dispersion here as the difference between the maximum and minimum prices across regions. But then you can see that starting in 2022, this red line, price dispersion in crude oil markets went up. And that's, of course, due to the war, to sanctions, to self-sanctioning of companies, and so on. But the interesting thing is we see similar phenomena for other commodities. One is here wheat, but then also for phosphates, lithium, and also in coal markets. So that's one other way to measure price dispersion.
So this is instructive, so I'll dwell on this for a second. First, thank you for using Bloomberg data. Second, as Ellen already alluded to, I mean, you notice that crude oil is pretty consistently the least dispersed. Yeah. And the jump in 2022 is, I presume, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. The wheat jump in 2020 was probably COVID-related restrictions. Mm-hmm. But then, to your point about critical minerals being more like chemicals, lithium is actually the one that's sort of elevated throughout the entire thing. So I think maybe that's part of the discussion is really what are we talking about? Because as you said, like with oil, there is a long track record going back to, say, Mark Rich finding ways around the embargoes, or even, let's say, the oil price cap that the G7 has tried to impose on Russia, which now seems to not be working as well as we thought maybe a few months ago, that markets find a way. But for things that are more niche, like critical minerals, then there isn't as much of a market, right? Therefore, you have more of those effects.
Absolutely. And I think what will be fascinating to see unfold over the next several years is whether or not kind of this idea of how do you keep the energy transition from being inflationary if your goal is to meet the call to climate action, or is your goal to achieve those economic gains and those economic wins from the market opportunity looking out from climate action? I think there's eventually going to have to be some sort of reflection as to, are we so committed to our economic leadership goals, right, looking out to 2050, and so dedicated to protecting certain industries that are going to transform over the course of that period, that we are willing to accept a likely more volatile, much more inflationary, commodity and specialty chemical market than we currently have. And because again, we're so early in this stage of actually deploying policy to realize those energy transition goals, I think there's a lot of ground still to be covered in that discussion.
So you've already mentioned the IRA, and I want to stick with that topic for a second. You didn't mention, Martin, in your slides that at the end of the paper there are the policy proposals, and you mentioned basically the first best option is don't fragment, right? Cooperate. The second is have something like a green corridor, so agree to sort of carve off certain things. But then in the paper there's the third best option, which is industrial policy, which the IRA would count as. I will play DC's advocate here and say, couldn't someone argue that industrial policies, or at least some types of industrial policy, are necessary to spur the increased capacity for certain commodities across blocks, therefore mitigating the risk that should such fractures occur, that they would have large economic effects? In other words, it might be true that in the short to medium term, or maybe even over a decade, that saying that critical minerals that go into high capacity batteries have to be coming from essentially allied countries of the U.S., that causes fragmentation and increases prices. But in the long run, if it works as intended, there'll be more production and refinement of those critical minerals in other countries, so which on net, I think, provides more insurance, or resiliency is the phrase they prefer to use in this town. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I'll offer a few thoughts. I think it might be illustrative to look at how China became so dominant in some of these markets. And if you kind of look at the history of how that happened, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but essentially the Chinese government provided huge amounts of funding to Chinese companies to basically go into these places to not only mine lithium, but also to then take it back to China and refine it there. And they put so much money into it that at certain points in the process there were huge oversupplies, and the government just said, that's okay, we're going to still keep the funding. And so I think that that's worth considering, both in terms of how an oversupply of, say, cobalt might actually impact the China-Russia bloc. If that scenario plays out and we are divided into two blocks, then yes, the China-Russia bloc will have an oversupply of cobalt and an oversupply of lithium. The question is, do they care? And I think that we've seen that the Chinese government is totally willing to subsidize any kind of losses that this will incur in order to maintain their control over those supply chains. So then the point to learn from that is, okay, so what can we do as the other side? Can we emulate that policy? I think probably not, but it's important to understand how they did it so that we can understand how they might react in the case of a kind of bifurcation. And maybe we can't pour that kind of money into developing our own supply chains and subsidize it to that effect, but maybe there are other ways to work around that. But I do think it's very important to understand that they didn't care that there was an oversupply for many years. They just kept at it, and now there's not. But also the fact that China can then, they kind of hold the levers. We may not even need a situation in which there is a fragmentation, because if China can just say, oh, well, our quota of cobalt to the US is now, we're just cutting it. That's essentially creating an artificial fragmentation, right? They're cutting off the supply. So that's why I think this model is particularly helpful, even in situations where we're not necessarily seeing a fragmentation. We're seeing something that causes a similar fragmentationary effect.
If we're skeptical that industrial policy, at least at scale, can build, let's say, a resilient secondary or U.S. bloc supply chain, and I'll just take that as a given. That could be a whole topic for a whole hour discussion. But if that's the case, you say there are other ways that could be managed. What are those? Is it just substitutability of finding alternatives?
Yeah, this was the point I was going to make, which is the question, the core of what you're asking is, how do you do industrial policy without actually stimulating additional fragmentation? And I think the question that, when the current market incumbent has achieved that position through high subsidization and will likely continue to do so, how do you, push back against that incumbency without committing to subsidize, those supply chains similarly at the same level, likely in perpetuity. The alternative, I think, and you brought this up, is industrial policy can also be incredibly useful in terms of incentivizing substitution and alternatives, right? Not just alternative supply chains on their own, but also technological alternatives. And that's also where I think you have a fair amount of blue ocean to cover in the minerals space. We're already seeing this begin to unfold if you take the EV battery product, for example. Early days, the EV chemistry du jour was the nickel manganese cobalt battery, right? The proportion of cobalt in those batteries and the amount of concentration in the Democratic Republic of Congo for that resource incentivized, right, considerable policy investment and financial investment in figuring out how to either reduce the amount of cobalt in those batteries or find a complete alternative, and that led to the lithium phosphate battery, right? Even now, as you're seeing the lithium phosphate gain market share, but also possibly be exposed to similar tightness, right? You're seeing the advent of the sodium-ion battery become an alternative as well. So I do think there's something to be said for industrial policy as a trigger for further substitutability and possibly alleviating some of the concerns and the tightness that you would otherwise see in you currently see in the marketplace.
So related question for Martin. The economic models you were using for this paper, what are the limits of those models in terms of what can they actually capture? Specifically, I want to ask, can they capture the effects of innovation or substitutability, particularly for, let's say, new products versus just switching based on existing goods?
Yeah, so our models do not capture explicitly innovation in finding substitutes or enhancing recycling or similar things. That's just the nature of these models, and we basically really focus on the fragmentation event and how that could affect prices and the economy. What our models also do not include is uncertainty. We have learned that uncertainty is quite important in driving the economy, and that's something that our model does also not include. And we can think about fragmentation scenarios where uncertainty plays a really big role, and so this could also enhance some of our results here. Let me say one thing on industrial policy. So we put a lot of emphasis that even as a third best option, industrial policies have to be well designed so that they are not discriminatory, that they prevent negative spillovers to other countries, and also to keep the fiscal risks limited.
Yes, the latter is something that I won't get on my hobby horse, but I think when a lot of these policies were designed, including the IRA, it was under a different sort of macro fiscal framework, which now we have 5% interest rates. It's going to be a little bit tougher, but okay. On the question of innovation, just one thing to flag, and because I love history, in the text box at the end when you talk about World War II, there are two great examples of substitutability. One is that Germany was not able to access all the oil it needed, so they developed a coal-based petrol, right? Which is not as efficient, but it worked. And on the U.S. side, the U.S. was cut off from rubber, I think basically in what is now Indonesia, and then eventually develop a synthetic substitute. So, innovation can find a way, which, there are a lot of factors in these models, but I'm generally optimistic about what innovation can do under extreme price pressures, or in case of government policy, maybe industrial policy, to make things work, and you can get through it. I have another modeling question, or at least results question to you, Martin. You talk about in the paper, obviously your baseline is having these two blocks that are sort of strict blocks. So the blocks are not trading with each other to get the maximum effect for illustrative purposes. But then you also mentioned that if you introduce third blocks, like let's call it a neutral block, the results diminish. How sensitive are the results to basically the emergence of a neutral block? Neutral meaning they can trade with both blocks.
Yes, so the results would become more modest in this case because there would be some arbitrage allowed between the blocks. It really depends on, again, what parameter you use to allow that arbitrage. So it's very hard to pin down in the real world what would that look like, and it may also change over time. Another thing that we looked at is the sensitivity to countries switching blocks. That's very important because that could become a new source of price volatility in commodity markets. So if you think about, for example, cobalt switching from one block to the other, that would have huge price swings in both of these blocks. And I think that's another thing that we highlight, that this increased price volatility could also affect economies.
So, sorry, just getting more questions. I'll read those in a second. So one question to address is, in the real world, what is the actual plausibility of blocks like this emerging? So in the case of, let's say, Russia, China, in a sense, that block does exist already, at least in terms of trade flows. But as we've seen with oil markets, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ellen, that they've essentially normalized with the ghost fleet and other mechanisms that which it was faster maybe than the U.S. government was expecting, but it happened, right? Which should have been expected at least eventually. And so, in what world will we get to a place where we would see anything like substantial fragmentation? Is that at least going forward? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
And I do think you're right about what happened with the oil market, and I think that one of the ways that we know that essentially it's kind of a non-issue anymore is that India is complaining about how high oil prices are, and India was one of the countries that was so excited to buy Russian oil at cut rate prices. So I think it tells you that there isn't even that much of a discount to buying Russian oil, even without Western insurance, and with all of the issues in terms of shipping and insurance, that it's still higher than they want. So I think that gives you a sense of how quickly prices have normalized. I mean, it didn't even take a year.
Right.
And we see that, we also saw that on the graph of the price of the fragmentation, where you could see August 2023 that the differential is just heading lower for crude oil. So on the other hand, I do think that's also a matter of caused by the fact that prices overall are much higher now than they were earlier in the year. I think that the development of a third block per se, or a neutral block, is basically a given in this kind of situation, because to me, we're not in the same place as we were during World War II or during the Cold War, where things were very bifurcated. And as we know, they weren't even as bifurcated as we thought they were. And so I don't think that there's any way, there's no way that the US or the EU can say to the world, okay, choose. You're either on our side or their side. There are too many countries with too many important commodities, essentially, to force a kind of a choice. These countries don't necessarily need, one of the ways that NATO could do that was saying, we're NATO and we'll protect you from evil communist incursion. Well, you're not going to be able to say that to Congo. They're not going to say, you're not going to protect us from Russian incursion. What's that even mean to us? We're already in bed with the Chinese, so we can't join your side. Even if we vote in the UN that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was wrong, we're not going to get out of this economic entanglement. So I think that really it's a given that is how things will play out. But I think that the model is illustrative in that there are other situations that can cause similar effects, such as, say, China basically deciding to not sell to the US or something like that. Or to impose some kind of quotas on their sales, because that can create basically a similar situation. And so I do think it's still particularly illustrative.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the third block is the interesting space to watch in this case for several reasons, frankly. First, the countries you would put into that third block are keenly aware that they have a fair amount of leverage in the minerals markets as they develop. They want to kind of get themselves out of the resource client model, right? That has dictated, mining and extractive industries for the past several decades, and so they're happy to try and bargain between the two big blocks to try and curate whatever gives them the best economic opportunity. Et cetera. What's interesting to me then is what does the relationship between Block A and Block B look like with Block C? And I think that's a space that is rapidly unfolding. How does as the United States seeks to build a supply chain that is resilient, that it has a fair amount of control over and security around, right? How does it engage with, say, in Indonesia, right? But determine that everything it gets out of Indonesia doesn't touch entities or corporations or countries which it deems unfriendly. That's, again, speaking to the immaturity of the marketplace as it stands right now, that requires a traceability mechanism. That requires some really well thought out frameworks to say, when I pull this out of the ground in this place, it moves from point A to point B to point C, all the way on down, and I know every step of that supply chain. We're just not totally there yet. And I think as that unfolds, we'll get a lot more clarity in terms of what the relationship with a block C would actually look like.
And I would say that I think that we can watch a little bit and learn from the oil market in this case, because right when the price cap was being implemented, the price cap policy was being implemented, countries immediately emerged as kind of these block C countries. So Indonesia was one, Turkey was another. They're saying, we're going to take the risk, we're going to import that Russian oil, crude oil, we're going to refine it, and we're going to sell it to Europe because they don't mind buying it from us. They just don't want to touch Russian oil directly. And in some respects, I wonder if that could mitigate the negative GDP impact of fragmentation on lower income countries, because there are economic opportunities there. If Europe is saying, well, we won't touch Russian crude oil, but we will touch that diesel that you made from Russian crude oil because we're paying Turkey, not Russia for it. Well, that's a huge opportunity, and an opportunity there to increase their GDP. So while yes, I think in general, the lower income countries may be losers in this respect, it exposes new economic opportunities that they may be very keen to get on. One example I think that we're seeing in the lithium space is that Hungary is really interested in producing EV batteries. Why? I don't think it's because their leader has suddenly become a huge climate activist. It's because there's a real economic opportunity there. And it's not because he wants everyone in Hungary to drive an EV. He sees an economic opportunity for his country to develop something that other people really want.
So recognizing we have about 90 seconds left, and I'll ask you all very briefly for final thoughts, but it seems to me that if you're ranking probabilistically what are the most likely risks to fragmentation, what I'm gathering is the top one is probably soft fragmentation, which I like that phrase, which is mostly policy driven, but it's already happening to some degree. The second would be not a guarantee, but definitely a risk, which is that China controls a lot of the critical mineral space, particularly refinement, right? And in almost any plausible scenario we would talk about, they're not going to be in a neutral block. So then maybe that's something to consider. And then finally, which we didn't talk about except in the historical case, which is the extreme scenarios, which is maybe war, maybe over Taiwan, and the impact of sanctions and other measures, which I know the Atlantic Council and others are doing research on, including Bloomberg Economics. But given that we have like 1 minute left, does anyone have any final comments or points they want to make?
Yeah, I think it will be really important to find multilateral solutions here, multilateral cooperation despite the geopolitical tensions, and to see where can we carve out spaces where these multilateral solutions are still possible. For instance, with a green corridor on critical minerals or a food corridor on food commodities. And then finally, we really need more information and data sharing on these minerals markets. They're very complex, as you said. And the information is just not out there, and so it will be important to have collaboration there.
Great. Ellen? Reed?
I have one thing. You mentioned this. We didn't really spend any time today talking about food security, right?
Yeah.
Which is its own, is its own source of complexity when you talk about fragmentation, because it's, if you want to see something that drives political instability, food security does that much more than minerals markets, right, do. And so I think that's also a space that we should pay more attention to. And thank you for, we wouldn't be a think tank if we didn't come up with some good terms like soft fragmentation. So I guess we can call this a success.
I should have mentioned the agricultural side, but I wish we had more time, but we do not. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to the IMF for having the launch of this report here. You can find it as part of the World Economic Outlook, which I think is, this chapter might be online today, if not very soon.
Just today at 9:30.
Okay, it's been
So it's
on
out
embargo,
there.
so please read the whole chapter. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting.